Clark Gable and Carole Lombard. Hollywood's brightest love story cut short. The kind of love that looked effortless. Some love stories feel built for legend, not because they last forever, not because they are perfect, but because, for one brief moment, they seem to hold everything people want love to be: beauty, laughter, chemistry, admiration, and that rare feeling that two people simply belong together. Clark Gable and Carole Lombard had that kind of love. He was the king of Hollywood masculinity, calm, magnetic, impossibly self-assured. By the late 1930s, Clark Gable was one of the biggest stars in the world, known for his effortless screen presence and the kind of charm that seemed almost unfair. She was different, fast, funny, fearless, sparkling with intelligence and energy, already celebrated as one of Hollywood's great screwball comedians. They were both major stars, but they moved through fame in completely different ways. And maybe that was part of the magic. Clark had a gravity to him. Carole had electricity. He seemed steady. She seemed alive in every direction at once. Together, they looked less like a publicity image and more like something rarer, a real bond between two people who made each other lighter. Their story would become one of old Hollywood's most beloved romances, not only because they were glamorous, but because they seemed genuinely happy together. And in classic Hollywood, that was not always the same thing. But their story would not be long. That, perhaps, is why it still hurts. Because some of the most beautiful love stories are not the ones that survive the longest. They are the ones that end before the world is ready to let them go. Clark Gable, the man the camera couldn't resist. By the time Carole Lombard truly entered his life, Clark Gable had already become a symbol. Born in Ohio in 1901, Gable rose from a modest background into movie stardom and built a screen persona that felt both masculine and relaxed. He was not ornate, not theatrical in the way some stars were. He made charisma look easy. By the 1930s, films like It Happened One Night and later Gone with the Wind had made him one of Hollywood's most iconic leading men, and he came to be known as the King. But behind that image was a more complicated man. Gable had already lived through difficult personal chapters before Carole became the center of his emotional life. He had been married before. He understood ambition, pressure, and the strange loneliness that can come with being admired by millions of strangers. To the public, he looked unshakable. But people who knew him often saw something more guarded, a man who could be warm and funny, but who did not hand over his private self easily. That matters when telling this love story. Because when Carole Lombard entered it, she did not just fall for a movie star. She reached the man beneath the legend. And for someone like Clark Gable, that may have meant everything. Carole Lombard, beauty with mischief, wit, and fire. Carole Lombard was not simply glamorous. She was vivid. Born Jane Alice Peters in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in 1908, she entered films young and gradually became one of the defining comic actresses of 1930s Hollywood. Britannica and TCM both place her among the era's major screen personalities, especially through the screwball comedies that showcased her speed, timing, confidence, and originality. She was not passive, delicate, or ornamental. She had force. That is what made her so compelling. Carole Lombard could be elegant one second and hilariously irreverent the next. She had beauty, yes, but beauty was never the whole story. She had comic intelligence, the kind that makes a person unpredictable and alive. In films like My Man Godfrey, Nothing Sacred, and Mr. and Mrs. Smith, she showed exactly why audiences loved her. She made chaos look charming and confidence look effortless. And yet behind all the wit was seriousness too. She worked hard. She knew Hollywood. She understood image, performance, and the cost of fame. That combination, humor on the surface, intelligence underneath, made her the sort of woman who could match a man like Clark Gable instead of merely admiring him. She was not there to be overwhelmed by him. She could stand beside him. And that is part of why their chemistry became so memorable. Their first meeting, a beginning that didn't look like destiny. It is almost poetic that one of Hollywood's most beloved couples did not begin with a media romance. Clark Gable and Carole Lombard met while making No Man of Her Own in 1932. Turner Classic Movies notes that this would be the only film in which they truly co-starred together, and that although posterity links them inseparably, they were not romantically involved at that point. Both were married then, and the relationship simply was not ready to begin. History. Com similarly notes that when they first met during that production, neither showed much interest in the other. That detail actually makes the story better, because it means this was not one of those instant cinematic thunderbolt romances. Not yet. The future was there, but it had not revealed itself. They met. They worked together. They moved on. And sometimes that is how the deepest stories begin, not with fireworks, but with a first chapter that does not yet know what it is. Years passed. Careers grew. Public images hardened into legend. Gable rose even higher. Lombard became one of Hollywood's brightest comic stars, and life kept moving until, several years later, they found each other again under very different emotional circumstances. This time, they were ready. When everything changed, laughter, ease, and the start of real love. By the mid-1930s, the relationship between Clark Gable and Carole Lombard took on a completely different shape. Sources describe a later reunion and courtship several years after their 1932 film, and from that point the connection became real and public. Britannica notes that they did not begin dating until years after first meeting, and TCM describes a well-publicized courtship that eventually led to marriage in 1939. What made them work so well seems, in part, to have been contrast. Carole brought spontaneity into Clark's life. Clark brought steadiness into hers. She was playful, impulsive, bold. He was more reserved, more contained, more traditional in his emotional presentation. But instead of clashing, those qualities seemed to have complemented each other. By many accounts, Carole made him laugh in a way few people could. She cut through his myth. She did not treat him like the king. She treated him like a man. And Clark, in return, gave her the kind of emotional seriousness that a brilliant, funny woman often longs for beneath all the banter, the sense that she was not just entertaining him, but deeply loved by him. That is one reason their love still feels so appealing. It was glamorous, yes, but it also seems to have been warm. Not merely scandalous, not merely decorative, warm. And old Hollywood, for all its elegance, did not always give the public much of that. Marriage, a Hollywood fairy tale that felt surprisingly real. In 1939, Clark Gable and Carole Lombard married in Kingman, Arizona. Britannica's Gable biography places the marriage in that year during the period of Gone with the Wind, and Lombard's Britannica entry likewise identifies Gable as the husband she married in 1939. For the public, this was irresistible. Clark Gable, already at peak legendary status. Carole Lombard, beloved, beautiful, funny, and dazzlingly alive. It looked like the perfect union of star power and affection. But what made their marriage especially memorable was that it did not seem like a cold studio arrangement or a polished public performance marriage. The romance had a lived-in quality. They spent time at their ranch in Encino, and their marriage acquired a reputation for genuine companionship rather than purely ornamental glamour. Modern retrospectives continue to describe it as one of classic Hollywood's happiest and most beloved unions. That image matters because it shapes the entire tragedy to come. If theirs had been a shallow marriage, the story would not linger the same way. But because the love seems to have been real, the loss feels sharper. They were funny together. They were affectionate together. They seemed, for a little while, to have found something rare in Hollywood, joy without performance. And perhaps that is the most haunting part. They really did look happy. A home built between stardom and ordinary life. There is a reason Clark and Carole remain so beloved in popular memory compared with many other old Hollywood couples. They did not only symbolize glamour. They also symbolized escape from it. For all their fame, their marriage carried a strangely grounded quality. Stories and later recollections often emphasize their life away from sets and premieres, the ranch, the informality, the playful energy between them, the feeling that Carole could bring levity to a man the entire world had turned into a monument. That domestic element gives their romance emotional depth. It means the love story was not built only on flashbulbs. It also had private texture. You can almost feel why audiences love them. They were glamorous enough to fascinate, but human enough to make people believe in them. Clark was still Clark Gable, of course, the great star, the screen giant. But Carole Lombard, with all her wit and brightness, seems to have softened the edges of that legend. She made him more reachable in the public imagination. He, in turn, gave their relationship the weight of sincere devotion. That kind of pairing is powerful because it feels balanced. He was admired by the world. She made him personal. She dazzled the world. He made her safe. For a time, at least, that balance held. War, duty, and the trip that changed everything. Then, history entered the story. After the United States entered World War II, Carole Lombard took part in a war bond rally in her home state of Indiana. Britannica states that in January 1942, she traveled there for the rally and history. Com reports that she helped raise an enormous amount in defense bonds before starting home. This is one of the most important emotional turns in the story because it reveals who Carole Lombard was beyond movie stardom. She was not only a star, she was engaged with the world around her. There is something deeply moving about that final public act. A beloved actress, already at the peak of her fame, using that fame in service of something larger during wartime America. She was not retreating into celebrity luxury. She was showing up. And in that sense, the final chapter of her life carried the same vitality that defined her career, full of movement, purpose, and generosity. But the return trip home will become one of old Hollywood's most devastating tragedies. On January 16, 1942, Lombard, her mother, and others were killed when TWA Flight 3 crashed near Las Vegas. Britannica states that she and 20 others died in a crash. Aviation records and history accounts put the total aboard at 22 and attribute the disaster to navigational error after departure from Las Vegas. She was 33 years old. And in that instant, one of Hollywood's brightest love stories was broken. Clark Gable's grief, when the legend could no longer protect the man. The death stunned the nation. Britannica says Lombard's passing left Gable emotionally shattered, and TCM likewise describes him as grief-stricken. Those words matter because they strip away the mythology and leave only the human truth. Clark Gable, the ultimate leading man, the image of masculine control, could not control this. He could not charm it away. He could not outstare it. He could not survive it unchanged. When a public figure loses someone in this way, the world often turns grief into spectacle. But the emotional center of this story is not spectacle. It is absence. One day, Carole Lombard was the sparkling, living force beside him. The next, she was gone, and the marriage that had seemed so full of ease and laughter suddenly became a story of memory. That is why this romance endures. Not only because they were beautiful, not only because they were famous, but because the tragedy feels cruelly real. There is no dramatic betrayal here. No slow, cooling into indifference. No glamorous collapse. There is simply love and then loss. And loss, when it arrives that suddenly, has a way of freezing a relationship in ideal light. It leaves behind not the compromises of long years, but the ache of what should have continued. After Carole, the life that continued, but not the same way. After Lombard's death, Gable became disenchanted with the film industry and joined the Army Air Forces during World War II. Britannica directly links that chapter to the loss of his third wife, noting both his disillusionment and his later military service, for which he received the Distinguished Flying Cross and Air Medal. That decision has become part of the mythology surrounding their love. Not because it solves grief. Nothing solves grief, but because it suggests a man changed at the core. Carole's death did not become a passing sadness in Clark Gable's life story. It became one of its defining wounds. Even though he later remarried, their marriage retained a special permanence in public memory. Britannica notes that Lombard was buried under the name Carole Lombard Gable, and widely circulated historical accounts also remember that Gable was buried beside her when he died in 1960. That detail says more than many pages of analysis could. Because in the end, after all the fame, all the films, all the years that came later, the emotional echo of Carole Lombard remained attached to Clark Gable's name. Not just in publicity, in memory. Why this love story still matters. So why does the story of Clark Gable and Carole Lombard still resonate so strongly? Because theirs feels like the kind of romance people want to believe is possible. A great star meets an equally dazzling woman. They do not simply look good together, they fit. They bring out something warmer, lighter, more human in each other. Then, just as the story seems to settle into happiness, history cuts through it without mercy. That structure gives the romance its strange power. It has glamour, but not only glamour. It has tenderness, not just chemistry. It has tragedy, but without melodrama. And perhaps most importantly, it carries the haunting aura of unfinished happiness. Clark and Carole were married only from 1939 until her death in 1942. Yet in that short time, they became one of Hollywood's most cherished couples. The brevity itself intensifies the legend. Their marriage did not have time to fade into routine. It remained luminous because it ended while still fully alive. That is why people still return to them. They represent not just star-crossed love, but interrupted joy. A love that stayed bright because it ended too soon. Clark Gable and Carole Lombard did not get the long ending audiences wish for. They did not grow old together. They did not become a soft, faded Hollywood memory. Their love never had the chance to become ordinary. Instead, it stayed suspended in time. He remained the king. She remained the brilliant, laughing queen of screwball grace. And together, they remained one of old Hollywood's purest romantic legends, not because their story was flawless, but because it felt real, joyful, and suddenly unbearably fragile. Some love stories are remembered because they survive everything. Clark and Carole are remembered for the opposite reason. They are remembered because, for one shining moment, they seem to have found exactly what so many people spend their lives searching for, and then fate took it away. That is what gives their story its glow. Not scandal, not myth alone, but the simple, devastating idea that sometimes the happiest love is the one the world loses too soon.